Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Michel de Montaigne, in his essay on affectionate relationships, de l'amitié, in its original French, tells us about a wide range of relationships that we often find ourselves within, some more often than others, and he wants to distinguish these from each other, but also note what the basis for affection within them could be. And some of these are relationships that we just sort of find ourselves within. Others are more a product of our own choice. And we'll talk about the importance of that in a bit. He begins by talking about a very great friend of his. We're going to jump over that and look at the more general stuff. So he is going to tell us little ways in that there seems to be nothing for which nature has better prepared us human beings than fellowship. And fellowship is a translation of société, being together in some sort of connection. It doesn't have to be the biggest society. It could be the society of the family. It could be all sorts of other arrangements as well. And he says, Aristotle says good lawgivers have shown more concern for friendship than for justice. And he's going to say within a fellowship, the peak of perfection consists in friendship. So friendship is at the top, but not every single kind of friendship, as we're going to see. Not everything that we call friendship. The friendship that he has in mind is one that is beautiful and noble, right? And he says forms of friendship which are forged or fostered by pleasure or profit or by public and private necessity are so much the less beautiful and noble and so much the less friendship in that they bring in some purpose, some goal, some point to them. And they have an end or fruition other than the friendship itself. So in the best form of friendship, that's the whole purpose of it. If you were to ask somebody, well, why are you friends with this person who you are so deeply friends with? They would rightly say to you, you missed the point. We're friends. That's the whole point of this. But with most other friendships, there could be something else going on, as we'll discuss. And then he goes on, and he says something else really quite interesting here. He says that nor do those four ancient species, now here in the translation of love, in the French it just says, type species, right? Conform to the highest form of friendship. And what are these four anciently acknowledged kinds of affection? Well, natural, which we're going to look at very shortly. Social, right? Hospitable. So this is an interesting thing. We could imagine that we're talking about ancient, what's often called guest friendship, xenia. So, for example, in the Odyssey, when Telemachus leaves Ithaca, he travels to Sparta, meets with Menelaus and Helen to get their advice. His family is friends with their family. They are from different city-states, lands, but they receive each other. But we could also think of this in terms of the many forms of hospitality shown by, for example, monasteries and convents to travelers. We could think of the knights hospitalers, right, who are taking people in. So receiving other people, hospitality. And then we have another one which is translated as erotic. The French for it is a little bit more direct, venerean, right, of the venereal matters. Don't think of disease, think of getting it on, wanting to have sex with somebody else, coming from Venus, right? The goddess who corresponds to Aphrodite in Greek, the goddess of lust. And so, these are 4 different kinds of relationships that we have. Very interestingly, and I usually don't bring this sort of stuff up, but in this particular translation by Screech, there's a footnote that suggests that we consult C.S. Lewis's The Four Loves. Now, do these 4 actually correspond to the 4 loves that Lewis distinguishes, claiming that these are there in ancient Greek language? Not exactly. So storge could correspond to the natural, the erotic, obviously, eros. Philia is friendship in the sense that Montaigne is talking about. And you also have agape, this self-giving love, which isn't really in there, except perhaps in the hospitable, if we're thinking about, medieval ages onward, but the social, not really part of that. So it's not a great one-to-one correspondence, and it would not be helpful for you to look at C.S. Lewis's Four Loves in this respect, I imagine. But we can say each of these is an area that matters to us. He's going to start out talking about the natural first in terms of familial relations. And he's not going to talk about all of them, all the potential relationships. He's going to talk mainly about children to their father. He doesn't talk about mothers. And then brothers, how do they relate to each other? So he tells us from children to fathers, it's more a matter of respect rather than of friendship. Friendship cannot exist between them because of their inequality. It might also interfere with their natural obligations. All the secret thoughts of fathers cannot be shared with their children for fear of begetting an unbecoming intimacy. So Montaigne would not be a fan of those parents who say, I'm my child's best friend. He said, no. You probably don't want to do that. And he talks about, other obligations where there might be the need to actually kill each other off. A bit extreme there. And then he says, there have been philosophers who actually didn't follow this out. He gives as a witness Aristippus, who, when he was being pressed about the affection he owed to his children since they'd sprung from him, he spat on the ground saying, well, that sprang from me too, and we also engender lice and worms, right? So not everybody buys into this. And we can think of many bad parents too, right, who treat their children pretty terribly. What about brother? He says, the name of brother is a good one. We often call people brother who aren't our actual blood brothers. I did this with my good friend. We made a brotherhood of our alliance. But brothers are traveling the same road and sometimes bump against each other while they're doing that. And he says that when it comes to sharing property or dividing it up, with the wealth of one becoming the poverty of the other, this can wondrously melt and weaken the solder binding brothers together, right? And, fathers and brothers, we can have totally different complexions, he says. And he gives the example, he is my son, he is my kinsman, but he's wild, wicked, or daft. And then he also says something really interesting about the familial relationships. Insofar as these relationships are matters that are commanded by the law, you're supposed to treat your siblings, parents in certain ways, children in certain ways, and by nature, nature's bonds, there's little of what he calls willing freedom about it. This is important for Montaigne, right? It's less a matter of choice and more you're kind of stuck with these people and you got to make the best of it. And he says that our willing freedom produces nothing more properly its own than affection, feeling affection towards somebody, and loving friendship, which is a translation of the term amitié, which is what this treatise is about. So we might acknowledge that we owe something to our brothers or to our parents or our children, but we might not actually care for them as much because we didn't choose the relationship itself. So that's that kind of relationship. He's also going to talk quite a bit about what he calls the passion men feel for women. I don't see how we couldn't just also make it broader and say erotic passion that people feel for each other because, Montaigne is writing about his own experiences, but we know that women can desire sex just as much as men can. As a matter of fact, if we go back to ancient mythology, Tiresias, who is changed from a man into a woman and had sex as both, supposedly said that women enjoy it much more than men do. Right? So there's different ways people feel about this. But it's interesting because Montaigne is going to say this is not comparable with friendship in the same way. Why? Well, he says that it is born of our own choice, but you can't put them in the same categories. And he says that the flames of passion are more active, sharp, and keen, but that fire is a rash one, fickle, fluctuating, and variable. It is a feverish fire subject to attacks and relapses, which only gets a hold of a corner of us. And sexual love, he's going to say, is a mad craving, désir forcené, for what flees us, what runs away from us. And its goal is enjoying a body, putting a body into a body or having a body put into one's body, doing all sorts of other stuff as well that's fun and enjoyable. And that's what its goal actually is. And so he says that it's subject to satiety. We can get bored with it. We can get tired of it. You get off, now you don't really need it quite so much. When he talks about marriage, he has some interesting remarks about this. He says, well, you have sex in marriage, obviously, but marriage, you only have freedom at the beginning. Once you bind yourself to another person, you are involved with them. And he says that you'll have to unsnarl hundreds of extraneous tangled ends, which are enough to break the thread of a living passion and trouble its course. Right? So we get bored with our partners in marriage. And then he says some rather pessimistic things. I don't think that you can really have a full friendship with a woman in a marriage. And he says there's no example of women attaining to it. And, he talks about the ancient schools of philosophy. And you're like, I'm not sure that you actually read widely enough or have experienced widely enough Montaigne. But that's what he says. Then when he turns to what he calls euphemistically the alternative license of the Greeks, which is essentially homosexuality, but of a different sort than we think of in the present, because it's tied particularly to the relationship of lover, generally an older man, to the beloved, a younger man who is considered attractive. The older man will pursue the younger man and very often will, give him gifts or open doors for him, but he's expected to get to have sex with the younger man, and will get tired of them after they age, unless there's something else going on there as well. And so he's going to say, that's abhorrent to our manners, and they practiced it. As they practiced it, it required a great disparity of age and divergence of favors. It didn't correspond to the perfect union and contiguity which we're seeking here. So it's not really friendship. It's not really the kind of okay sexual engagement in Montaigne's own time that we see. And so he's going to mention one other thing. It could turn into friendship. And the Stoics actually did talk about good love as being motivated by the beauty, but as having a tendency to turn into friendship. But you could also say, well, how often does that happen, right? And so then he says, I now return to a kind of love more equable and equitable. We call, what we normally call friends and friendships are actually no more, he says, than acquaintances and familiar relationships bound by some chance or some suitability, by means of which, so it's not just nothing, our souls support each other. So, you go to school with somebody and you become friends with them because you're familiar with them. You had similar experiences. They're your army buddies. You've been in the same workplace. You belong to the same club or group or team or something like that, and you become friends, right? Oftentimes it can be, well, your spouses are friends with each other, so you are now friends with the other person's spouse, right? So there's all sorts of possible contingent relationships, and Montaigne is perfectly fine with those not being the highest, closest kind of friendship, because we have that so often. And he says, in the friendship I'm talking about, souls are mingled and confounded in so universal a blending, they efface the seam which joins them together. So there's a unity and unification that happens in the perfect kind of friendship, what he calls a noble friendship, a genuine consensus or intermingling of wills, of what it is that makes us most what we are. And so that is, in some respect, the highest willing freedom that we can have with each other. Now, of course, we have to be decent people. It's not all that common for us to find a friend like that. And he says that, you should try to make sure that you don't mix up these different kinds of friendship. There's the perfect highest form of friendship, and then there's all the other kinds of friendship that we enjoy and experience. He gives a bunch of examples, which I'm going to skip over here. And he says that, coming back to common friendships, they can be shared. And what does that mean? He says, in one of our friends, we can love beauty. In another, affability. They're easy to get along with. In another, generosity. They invite us out for dinner. In another, a fatherly affection. In another, a brotherly one. And so on. That's not what we're going to have in the highest form of friendship. That's more complete. But it's okay for lower forms of friendship to not have all of that going on. A little bit later on in the essay, he says, for the intimate companionship of my table, I choose the agreeable, not the wise. The wise, nothing wrong with them. They're great. But I want people that I can actually have a good dinner with. In my bed, beauty comes before virtue. He's really talking there about sexual relationships. And he's saying, I'm not looking for a woman who is a perfect moral paragon. I want somebody who, I find attractive and hopefully finds me attractive as well. And he goes on and says, in social conversation, ability, even without integrity, and so on. So we want different relationships for different purposes. And, although he doesn't say this here, it would be kind of a good inference to draw that perhaps we don't have to try to turn everything into a complete friendship, particularly sexual relationships. But even regular, ordinary, common friendships, we don't have to treat them as if they are the best thing in the world. That would be kind of a beginner's mistake, we might say. So we have this very wide range of affectionate relationships that Montaigne is examining here. Obviously, he gives much more scope to friendship, but the others enter into a good life as well.